I stood in courtroom 4B as my sister-in-law, Brenda, sneered at me from the plaintiff's table. She wasn't satisfied with taking my late brother's estate. She wanted to strip away my pride, too. She claimed my medal, a Navy Cross I earned in the Navy, was an unauthorized military display that intimidated her during probate. But when the judge ordered me to take off my Navy Cross right then and there, he didn't just cross a line. He triggered a sequence of events that exposed a high-level judicial cover-up. By the time the dust settled, Brenda was facing federal charges, and the judge lost his bench, his pension, and his freedom. My name is Sarah Miller. I'm 32 years old, and this is the story of how a greedy relative tried to humiliate a veteran and accidentally brought down an entire corrupt system instead. I was 32 years old, a Navy veteran who had survived 2 tours overseas, but nothing in my military training prepared me for the war that broke out in my own family. My older brother, David, had always been my rock. He was 37, brilliant, and fiercely hardworking, having built a multi-million-dollar regional logistics company from the ground up in our hometown. David was the kind of man who took care of everyone around him, especially after our parents passed away. When I served, he sent care packages every single month, reminding me that home would always be waiting. When David suddenly collapsed from a silent, undiagnosed heart condition, my entire world shattered into pieces. I was devastated, grieving the only immediate family I had left. But before the grass on his grave could even settle, the real nightmare began. Enter Brenda, David's wife of just 3 years. Brenda was 4 years older than David, sharp, impeccably dressed, and driven by a cold, calculating ambition. From the moment they met, I had a strange gut feeling about her. But David was happy, so I kept my mouth shut. The second David was gone, though, the grief-stricken widow routine evaporated. Within 72 hours of the funeral, Brenda changed the locks on David's house, froze all business accounts, and barred me from stepping foot inside his logistics office. David had always promised me our grandfather's antique pocket watch and a small parcel of family land we spent our childhood summers on. He'd even written those wishes down in a signed, personal codicil just months before he died. But Brenda didn't care about David's memory. She only cared about total control of his $4 million estate. When I presented the signed document to her attorney, Brenda didn't just reject it. She filed a preemptive lawsuit against me, accusing me of fabricating the will and harassing her. That was the moment I realized Brenda wasn't just grieving. She was a wolf in designer clothes, ready to strip away everything David cared about. 2 weeks later, I found myself walking through the heavy oak doors of County Courthouse 4B for our initial probate hearing. I refused to let Brenda intimidate me, so I wore my service dress blue uniform, crisp, tailored, and displaying the decorations I'd earned honorably. Pinned proudly over my heart was my Navy Cross, a honor forged in sacrifice and service. I wasn't trying to make a scene. I simply wanted to honor my brother and stand tall in the face of Brenda's vicious lies. As I sat at the defense table next to my lawyer, I watched Brenda glide into the courtroom wearing a black designer dress, accompanied by her high-priced attorney, Arthur Vance. She glanced over at me, her eyes narrowing into cold slits as they landed on the gleaming metal on my chest. She whispered something to Arthur, who immediately smirked, nodded, and stood up before the judge even took his seat. Judge Harold Vance, Arthur's uncle, though nobody was openly declaring that conflict of interest, swept into the room with an air of absolute superiority. He was a man in his late 60s with thin gray hair and a reputation for being ruthless to anyone who questioned his authority. Before my attorney could even introduce our first motion, Arthur raised a dramatic objection. "Your Honor," Arthur proclaimed, gesturing toward me with theatrical disdain. "The defense is engaging in blatant emotional manipulation. Wearing a military uniform complete with combat decorations to a civil probate hearing is a cheap tactic designed to intimidate my client and improperly bias this court." I waited for Judge Vance to throw out the ridiculous objection. Instead, he leaned over his bench, his eyes locking onto mine with unmistakable hostility. "Counsel is correct," Judge Vance growled, his voice echoing off the courtroom walls. "This court will not be turned into a circus for military posturing. Ms. Miller, you will remove that medal immediately, or I will hold you in direct contempt of court and have you removed to a cell." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over courtroom 4B. Brenda's lawyer wore a smug grin, and Brenda herself didn't even bother hiding her cold, triumphant smirk. Every protective, angry instinct inside me screamed at me to fight back, to tell Judge Vance exactly what that Navy Cross represented and the brothers in arms I'd lost earning it. But my military training immediately kicked in. Outrage was an emotional trap. Discipline was a weapon. I looked Judge Vance dead in the eye, reached up with steady hands, unpinned the medal from my uniform chest, and carefully slipped it inside my jacket pocket. I didn't say a word. I just nodded once, letting my quiet compliance mask the icy fire now burning in my chest. If this judge wanted to abuse his power to protect my brother's greedy widow, he was about to learn a very hard lesson about picking fights with trained logistics veterans. The hearing ended as expected. Judge Vance shot down every single one of my motions, granting Brenda temporary full control over David's estate pending a final ruling next month. But as soon as I got home that evening, I didn't cry. I opened my laptop and went to work. During my 8 years in the Navy, my specialization had been supply chain auditing and intelligence logistics. I knew how to follow paper trails, spot administrative anomalies, and reconstruct hidden networks. I spent the entire night digging into County Court 4BS public electronic records. That's when the first red flag popped up. Probate motions like Brenda's typically took 4 to 6 months just to get a hearing date. Brenda's petition had been fast-tracked in less than 9 business days, personally hand-stamped and cleared by Judge Vance himself. When I cross-referenced the judge's annual financial disclosure forms with local commercial real estate registry filings, my stomach dropped. Judge Vance's wife was listed as the registered agent for a newly formed LLC. Created just 3 weeks after my brother died, I needed absolute proof before I took another step, so I reached out to Marcus, a former naval intelligence buddy who now worked as a senior digital forensics analyst for a private security firm. Marcus didn't ask questions. He just took the LLC registration numbers and corporate filing IDs I sent him and started pulling back the layers. Within 48 hours, Marcus called me back, his voice dropping to an intense whisper over the encrypted line. What he found wasn't just a simple conflict of interest, it was a calculated, multi-$100,000 kickback scheme. 3 days after David's funeral, Brenda had quietly transferred a 30% non-voting stake in David's commercial logistics warehouse to a subsidiary company called Apex Ridge Properties. When Marcus traced the ownership structure of Apex Ridge, the paper trail led straight through 3 separate shell accounts registered in Delaware, eventually terminating at a private trust managed by Judge Vance's adult son. The value of that warehouse stake was conservatively estimated at $400,000. In exchange for transferring that equity under the guise of consulting fees, Judge Vance was ensuring that Brenda received full control of David's $4 million primary estate, effectively stripping me out of the inheritance entirely while lining his family's pockets. It was a textbook pay-to-play operation executed under the cover of judicial immunity. Brenda got the estate, Arthur Vance got his massive legal fee, and Judge Vance got a cozy retirement kickback disguised as a corporate partnership. They thought because I was just a grieving sister without a high-priced corporate legal team, I would fold after being humiliated in court. They had no idea that instead of breaking me, Judge Vance's order to remove my medal had forced me to view the courtroom not as a place of justice, but as a target environment. I didn't take the evidence to the local police department or file a motion with the court clerk. Local channels were compromised, and Vance had spent 2 decades building alliances in the district. Instead, I bypassed local authorities entirely and submitted a comprehensive 80-page digital dossier directly to the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force and the State Judicial Inquiry Board. 48 hours later, 2 federal agents met me at a diner off the highway. They were stunned by the forensic precision of the paper trail Marcus and I had assembled. The evidence was ironclad, but the federal prosecutors wanted absolute proof of active collusion on the record. They asked me to let the final disposition hearing proceed as scheduled so they could execute a sting. On the day of the final hearing, courtroom 4B was standing room only. Brenda sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a victorious smile and flashing a massive diamond ring. Her lawyer, Arthur, looked as relaxed as a man who already knew the outcome. Up on the bench, Judge Vance cleared his throat, adjusting his black robe with solemn grandeur. He shuffled his papers, glanced down at my defense table, and began reading his prepared final summary judgment. He declared David's personal codicil entirely fraudulent, awarded Brenda absolute ownership of every asset, and ordered me to pay $200,000 in Brenda's legal fees as punishment for frivolous litigation. "This court finds no merit in the defense's claims," Judge Vance proclaimed, lifting his gavel to bring it down. "This case is dismissed with prejudice." Before the gavel hit the wooden block, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open. 4 armed federal marshals walked down the center aisle, followed by Lead Agent Miller from the FBI. The entire room went dead silent as Agent Miller marched straight past the bar, pulled out a federal arrest warrant, and addressed the bench. "Harold Vance, step away from the bench. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, bribery, and honest services fraud." The quiet courtroom descended into utter chaos in a matter of seconds. Brenda's jaw dropped so low she looked like she'd seen a ghost, and her lawyer frantically jumped up, trying to interpose himself between the marshals and his uncle. But the federal agents pushed past him without a word. Judge Vance's face turned from a deep, arrogant crimson to a sickly, pale white as 2 marshals escorted him out from behind his mahogany bench, placing his hands behind his back and clicking heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists right in front of a room full of shock-stricken spectators. The fallout was swift and absolute. News of a sitting circuit judge being dragged off his own bench in handcuffs made front-page headlines across the entire state. The FBI raid on Vance's chambers and home yielded mountain loads of evidence, revealing that my brother's estate wasn't the first case he'd rigged. The State Judicial Commission immediately stripped him of his bench and permanently revoked his law license. Within 6 months, Vance pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud and tax evasion, receiving a 9-year sentence in a federal penitentiary and forfeiting his entire judicial pension. Brenda didn't escape the wrecking ball, either. The moment the federal investigation hit, her civil claims against my brother's estate collapsed into dust. The state prosecutor indicted her as a co-conspirator in the bribery scheme, seizing all her assets pending trial. Facing mountain-high legal bills, public humiliation, and the threat of severe prison time, Brenda's high society life crumbled completely. With Brenda legally disqualified, the probate court invalidated all her claims and recognized David's true final wishes. I was appointed as the sole executor of my brother's $4 million estate, securing the family land, our grandfather's watch, and ensuring David's company was protected from corporate vultures. Brenda had tried to take everything I loved, but her own unchecked greed ended up costing her freedom, her reputation, and her entire future. 3 months after Judge Vance was led away in handcuffs, I returned to County Courthouse 4B to formally close out David's estate. The courtroom looked entirely different that day. Sunshine poured through the tall glass windows, illuminating a new, honorable judge presiding over the bench with quiet dignity. I didn't wear a dark business suit or try to blend into the background. I wore my crisp service dress blue uniform once again, immaculate and sharp. Pinned proudly over my left pocket was my Navy Cross, gleaming brightly under the courtroom lights. This time, no corrupt judge ordered me to take it off. No smug lawyer scoffed at my service. I stood tall, representing the discipline, honor, and truth that my brother and I had always believed in. As the judge signed the final decree restoring David's legacy to its rightful place, he looked down at me from the bench and gave a respectful nod. "Thank you for your service, Ms. Miller," he said softly. "And thank you for reminding this court what integrity looks like." Walking out of those heavy oak doors and into the crisp afternoon air, I pulled our grandfather's antique pocket watch out of my pocket and checked the time. For months, I had carried the heavy weight of grief, anger, and betrayal on my shoulders. But as I stood on the courthouse steps, looking up at the clear blue sky, I finally felt a deep, peaceful quiet inside. Brenda and Judge Vance tried to humiliate me by stripping away my honor, but they completely forgot that true honor isn't something given or taken away by a judge's gavel. It's forged in character, proven through actions, and defended when it matters most. They lost everything because they built their lives on lies and greed. I walked away free, holding my brother's memory intact, with my Navy cross pinned right where it belonged.